Deportation is a buzzword, and a lot of people don't actually know what it means or how it functions. When we as immigration lawyers talk about deportation defense or deportation proceedings, we're talking about representing people, defending people who are in immigration court. And people find themselves in deportation proceedings in immigration court in one of two ways. Either they were apprehended or they were paroled in at the border and they're asking for protection or asylum in this country, or they had status or they were already living in the country and they were apprehended, maybe after being pulled over, maybe after a raid at a work site, and immigration agents arrested them and placed them in proceedings. So both of these categories of immigrants find themselves in deportation proceedings, and it's a court, just like a criminal court, except there's no jury. You have an immigration judge, and you have a Department of Homeland Security prosecutor, essentially, and then the client and their attorney. And you have to put forth a defense before the judge, and you provide testimony, you bring experts, the client prepares for cross-examination, you submit a lot of evidence to the judge, and you go to a trial, essentially, to defend your deportation so that you can stay in the country. Have you ever wondered how people actually get deported from this country? Well, if an immigrant finds themselves in deportation proceedings, either they're new to the country and they came in at the border, or they were already living here and they got picked up somehow and placed in proceedings. And the people who came in at the border have fewer options and fewer rights. Typically, those people are asking for asylum, and if they don't prove and win their case, they'll get deported. But the people who were living inside the country, and maybe they got picked up after an arrest, maybe there was a raid at their work site, and they get placed into deportation proceedings, they're going to have more options available to them that depend upon their life here, their family here, their timeline. Do they have good moral character? And in immigration court, we think about sort of enforcement priorities for the agency of the Department of Homeland Security. And enforcement priorities means someone that the government actually wants to deport. Generally, that's going to be people with significant criminal history, usually in one of four categories: theft, violence, drugs, weapons. Somebody's got a criminal history in one of those four categories, they're going to have really limited options and probably will receive a deportation proceeding. One other category that matters is gang-related activity. So even if somebody doesn't have a criminal history, but there's been suspicion of gang-related activity in their past, it's going to be a lot more difficult for someone like that to stay in this country. But at the end of the day, the person who decides all of this is the immigration judge, and it's up to the Department of Homeland Security prosecutor to bring their case, and it's up to the immigrant and their defense attorney to bring their case and their defense about why they should get to stay in the country. And then the judge will balance all of this evidence and testimony and make a determination at the end of the trial. One of the main reasons that people get deported from this country is because they have a criminal history. And one of the things that immigration lawyers like me don't often talk about is whether we think that makes sense or we support that. Because if someone like me spends their career defending immigrants, it would make sense that I would only ever say things about why immigrants shouldn't be deported. And I understand from a common sense perspective why someone might think if an immigrant has a conviction for 3 DWIs or domestic violence, well, that's it. They should be deported. And I understand that thinking. But here's the perspective I bring as someone who's been working with clients like this for decades now, is that there's nuance to these things. Let's say that someone had their last DWI more than a decade ago, and now they're, raising their kids, single dad, have, completely rehabilitated themselves, and yet they carry these criminal convictions. Or maybe someone signed a plea deal in a domestic violence case for reasons, even though the facts didn't actually match what was in the report. Of course, that's not always the case, but often there is a nuance like that to these defense cases that immigration lawyers like me do. And the truth of the matter is, we have a criminal justice system that has a whole process of convicting people and sentencing them, and people serve their time and they end their time, and then they face this second round of review in immigration court. So sure, there's people who are actively violent and dangerous and don't belong in this country. But to be able to just say, well, it's black and white and people in this category should go and everybody else should stay is not really possible. You have to dive into these cases and really understand them. And so anybody who gets on camera and says, I believe that these people should be deported and these people shouldn't, haven't spent enough time working with the clients to understand the nuance. Let's say an immigrant finds themselves in a deportation case and they've been ordered deported by the judge. What happens now? Well, there's a window of time, typically 30 days, where the immigrant can appeal the decision. And that goes to a court called the Board of Immigration Appeals, which is the appellate body over the immigration court. And they may have all sorts of reasons for the appeal. Evidence wasn't considered, something wasn't right, etc. And they're going to file their application with the BIA, the Board of Immigration Appeals, and that appellate body is going to decide whether the deportation order stands or it doesn't. Typically, most immigrants who have received a deportation order should immediately have that order reviewed by an immigration lawyer who does deportation defense work, so that that lawyer can file an appeal in the small window of time that we have to save that case. When someone finds themselves in deportation proceedings, one of the options available to them is to ask for something called voluntary departure. And that's essentially saying to the judge, I'm not going to fight my case. I'm not asking for asylum. I'm not asking for these other, cancellation of removal. I will leave the country, but I want to leave on my own terms. I want to gather my own things. I want to pack up my own house, deal with my pets, and I will leave by a certain date. And when I leave, I don't have a deportation order on my record, which then means it's easier for me to come back down the road through some other method. But one of the things to keep in mind, number one, is that voluntary departure is a benefit that the judge can grant or deny. And number two, do not take voluntary departure if you don't actually plan on leaving the country, because then if you don't leave, the consequences are even greater. And that's something I see often. People who were in deportation proceedings, they asked for voluntary departure, they knew they weren't going to leave, they didn't leave, and then they come to me and there's almost nothing to do at that point.